Now, the title is Pseudoscience After Feyerabend, and you might be wondering why after Feyerabend? What's particularly distinctive about his relationship to pseudoscience and the philosophy of science? Well, one reason is very pragmatic, is that pseudoscience is a very vague term, and it's also a gigantic term. So pseudoscience has been applied to parapsychology, cryptozoology, ufology, but also to areas of the sciences that are more borderlands, such as string theory. Also, the category of pseudoscience is extremely hard to define. If you read any of the philosophical literature on pseudoscience, you'll find an enormous range of positions. There are different issues of metaphysics, epistemology. There are political issues about the definition of pseudosciences. There's a really rich history and sociology for the pseudosciences. And that's just far too much to tackle for one evening. So we're going to make it a little more manageable by focusing on what Feyerabend has to think. Now, those of you in the audience who know Feyerabend's philosophy might think it's very strange that introducing Feyerabend into a discussion would ever make it more manageable. But what Chiara and I want to show tonight is that Feyerabend had distinctive ways of thinking about pseudoscience that can be very useful to us. And also, as we'll explain shortly, Feyerabend was also notorious for a period in his life for seemingly defending a variety of pseudosciences. So Feyerabend is both our way into thinking about pseudoscience and one of the main characters of the story that we're going to tell. And to start that story, I'll turn over to Chiara.
Bad start. Thank you, Ian. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see all the people who are joining us from very far away. It's really exciting. So I've had conversations about Feyerabend with Ian. We kind of worked out it's almost a decade and a half that we've had conversations, and we both got into Feyerabend through teaching philosophy of science. I mean, Ian is an expert on Feyerabend, but alongside working on Feyerabend for bits of my research, my main route into Feyerabend was through teaching Feyerabend to undergraduate students. And of all the kind of authors that I was teaching, Feyerabend was the hardest to pin down, but also the most fun to teach. He was also the one who was most open to lots of misunderstandings. One of the things that I think we are going to try to do tonight is to sort of highlight Feyerabend has a bad reputation. So depending on who you talk to, they will say, oh, Feyerabend, that postmodernist who basically opened up a can of worms and then it all went downhill from there, or it opened up science for the possibility of ruling too many things into account as having equal value with science. What we want to do tonight, I think, is to a certain extent to sort of like tone down that. I know that in our audience there are people who have worked a lot on Feyerabend. One of the things that I found personally very helpful has been the periodization of the different stages of Feyerabend's thought that has been proposed by many great academic colleagues, Ian included, in fact, that really kind of show how Feyerabend himself changed his mind throughout his career. And so one of the things that we might try to do is actually sort of attribute as much as we can bits of ideas to specific portions of his thought, and also account a little bit for how he changed his mind. One of the things that we're worried about is, like, would Feyerabend want anything to counter science? We believe that he was actually a believer in science in his own right. He was thinking about how we make science better. And in order to do this, he stepped into what at the time was the minefield of discourses around pseudoscience, and really deeply engaged with bits of thought that were considered to be a little bit suspicious in order to sort of pick up the claims. But Ian, maybe we want to say something, first of all, about where this idea of pseudoscience emerged and the landscape of the debates before we zoom in into Feyerabend.
Yes, because Feyerabend is a good integrated history and philosophy of science scholar. And Feyerabend would always remind us that you can't do philosophy of science properly in most cases unless you know some of the history. And of course, one of the key tasks for the history of science is to try to track changing understandings of science, different conceptions of what science is, and these are always going to be very historically fluid. And I suppose one way to think about the concept of a pseudoscience is we're trying to mark out something of the changing borders of science. So take one example, late 19th century, huge amounts of research by what we would recognize as scientists into psychical phenomena, including by very leading scientists of the late Victorian period, like Sir William Crookes. At this point, people are interested in newly reported kinds of psychical and spiritualistic phenomena. And one of the reasons that they're interested, I think, is to try to work out whether this is the sort of thing, the sort of phenomena that could actually be investigated. Now, it's partly by exploring those borderland areas that you try to get some changing sense of what science is. The problem is, I suppose, with the pseudoscience debate is that you can only really try to mark out the borders if you have some criteria for what belongs on that side and what belongs on this side of the border. And in some cases of science, those criteria don't exist. People are just creeping forwards, trying to explore, playing with the ideas that they have. But over time, people would, I suppose, Chiara, try to develop fixed or definitive criteria of scientificity.
Yeah, so at the time, what was big in philosophy of science is known amongst the philosophers of science as the demarcation problem, right? And it was, to a certain extent, I think this is something, there is a lot of debate in the academic community over, should we still continue to teach Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Imre Lakatos, Paul Feyerabend? My take on that is that yes, because that is part of the history of our discipline. Although you end up with this barrage of white men introducing philosophy of science, and you need to be very, very careful in pitching it that way, obviously. So I try to, when I teach these topics, I always try to sort of give counterpoints. So, and I also acknowledge I'm putting on the board a list of white middle-aged men. Philosophy of science is not all like that, thank God, right? But I do think that a lot of what was done was precisely in response to the shortcomings of that earlier generation, as well as taking on board some of those key ideals. One of the problems and one of the realizations when it comes to the demarcation problem was precisely that the initial quest was, to a certain extent, a clear-cut sort of way of saying, if I come up with this set of criteria, then whatever doesn't fall into this set of criteria is just needs to be ruled out as pseudoscience or non-science or as politics, religion. So it was a big container that was created, and some philosophers have tried to carve more sophisticated distinctions when it comes to the non-science part. But that quest, I don't think it lasted very long. And I think Feyerabend was one of the great voices in saying, well, however many criteria you might find, if you go and look historically at what has counted as science, and that was also something that Thomas Kuhn very much brought to the forefront. It's one thing to look at science as it is now and stop everything and say, okay, let's create these boxes. And even then, things are vague and undefined. It's another thing to go and look back. And then you will find that Newton was practicing a lot of alchemy, right? And that religion was woven into the ideas that we tend to kind of mark as the scientific revolution. And that astrology was part and parcel of how astronomy was carried out, right? So even at that, and at that point, what philosophers like Kuhn, Feyerabend really brought to the fore was that if we want to find criteria, or if we want to talk about what counts as science, we need to also develop that hand in hand with a certain type of historical sensitivity, right? There is a very underrated paper by Paul Taggart, which engages with the question of whether astrology is a science or a pseudoscience. And Taggart gives a really nice kind of moving line for things to be placed on a continuum where if you look and zoom in on the historical period, they will keep shifting place. And if I may go on a little bit for longer, and we can take this up again if you want, but the question of psychical research is a really important one that you were raising as the prequel, because one of the things that current research in psychical research is showing is that even at the time where these type of endeavors, even when you think you have found a clear-cut criterion and you say, okay, spiritualism nowadays, who would believe in table turning, right? When you go back and zoom in into that historical record, you will see that the debate of how to handle this was very much a very lively debate and a very passionate debate, but also there were different subtleties in the positions and the reasons why people wanted to go and investigate psychical phenomena. There is an amazing book by Roger Lockhurst, which is called The Invention of Telepathy. This is my first prop here. And it's a cultural history of telepathy. And at some point in this book, Lockhurst defines telepathy as the hyphen between psychophysiology, right? It is in that space in between the kind of emergent ideas of unconscious in psychology and a lot of physics, actually psychophysics, and a lot of idea in physics. So you are at a time where unconscious processes are beginning to make it to the forefront, unconscious perceptions, the idea that there is a part of us that acts unconsciously. And at the same time, in physics, you got discoveries such as the X-rays, the idea of the ether. So it's quite interesting that debates around telepathy, which we now consider to be a pseudoscience, were actually debates where people were really trying to figure out those spaces in between the physics and the psychology of the time. And if you look at it from that perspective, then there is a lot more that you can say, not so much over whether this is science or pseudoscience by our current standards, but more about what were the values and the commitments that drove scientists and scientific practitioners towards those concepts. Sorry, I've spoken a lot.
No, it's helpful, Chiara, because that sets up at least three big points I think Feyerabend was trying to teach us about pseudoscience. And you can tell me what you think about these. So the first is, when we're trying to seek out demarcation criteria, plural, are we trying to seek ahistorical criteria? Because, of course, you know, when Newton is doing his advanced mathematical physics, he is also, as you said, working on biblical prophecy, the end of the world. He was trying to calculate what angels know about the cosmos. To us, very unscientific, but to him, no sense of tension. And as conceptions of what science is change over time, so presumably would conceptions of what pseudoscience would be. Second thing I think Feyerabend would want to emphasize is, whenever we debate pseudoscience, we usually have very specific pseudosciences in mind. They're always certain hot button sciences. So in the late 19th century, telepathy and psychical research were very, very big. But at later stages of history, maybe from the 1950s, ufology starts to come into the fore. That becomes very culturally salient. And then much later, psychical phenomena and telepathy and remote viewing come back into popularity in the 1970s, ancient astronaut theory. So there's a changing parade of different alleged pseudosciences that become more or less relevant at different times. And I think a third thing Feyerabend might want to emphasize is, when people criticize pseudosciences, they use a whole range of different kinds of arguments that they don't always distinguish. So these days, one common argument against psychical phenomena is a metaphysical argument. Reality is just not like that. There is no disembodied spiritual realm. There is no psychical realm. So ghosts, psychical phenomena, rebirth, telepathy, those things can't be objects of sciences because they don't exist. Reality is naturalistic. Those things just ain't. Whereas that's quite different from, let's say, arguments against cryptozoology. There's nothing metaphysically impossible about large, unknown, anthropoid, ape-like creatures. It's just very unlikely that they exist, goes the argument. So those would be metaphysical arguments. Whereas in other cases, the arguments might be historical or epistemological. And there might be arguments that we don't spot at the time. So Feyerabend briefly discusses so-called ancient astronaut theory. the idea that many ancient civilizations have what seems unusually advanced scientific knowledge, metallurgical skills, construction abilities, scientific knowledge. What's the best explanation? And for a fellow called Eric von Daniken, the best explanation is consult their mythologies. There are mysterious creatures coming from the heavens as culture bearers, granting human beings advanced technologies. And then you have his ancient astronaut theory. How do the ancients have this knowledge? Aliens came to Earth. Now, one objection that is noted these days, but wasn't noted at the time, is, among other things, this is just a really, really racist explanation. How on earth could ancient Indians and Africans have advanced knowledge? Well, maybe they're just ingenious and creative and sophisticated civilizations. That objection wasn't as popular in the 1970s, but nowadays, maybe because we've all gone woke, that's just a much more compelling objection. So there's 3 lessons maybe Feyerabend wants to teach. How permanent are these criteria? Which sciences and pseudosciences are on the agenda and why? And what sorts of arguments are we going to deploy against them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree, and this is really spot on. And I think one of the things that kind of like brings them together is what is at stake. So you can think about criteria because you want some sort of like philosophical clarity about, how do we go about thinking about these things? And I respect that exercise, and it's really helpful. But precisely as you pointed out, Ian, these criteria are not independent of, like, even the way we come up with these criteria is not context independent, right? They are criteria that are always developed and they change depending on whether you're doing the demarcation type of playing the demarcation game in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, or nowadays, right? I like the way sociologists of science go about it, because, again, roughly a little bit later, but contemporary to some of the later Feyerabend, Thomas Gearin, for example, sociologist of science, came up with this idea of boundary work, right? So he zoomed in on a lot of historical and even more contemporary to him case studies, and he basically asked the question, what is at stake? What are the scientists trying to secure when they are saying this counts as science and it's done in a scientific way? And it's about securing financial resources, securing power, as well as securing the credibility of the field. And of course, there is the knowledge that you get out of it, but they are so entangled, and you can't quite pull them apart. And I think, and Gearin, to a certain extent, was responding to how the philosophers were setting up the demarcation problem, because his idea was, well, you philosophers, you sit down and pontificate about fixed criteria. The sociologist goes into the lab, looks at the scientist, goes and digs into the historical records and takes that kind of sociological perspective. And from there, you think about issues of power as well as issues of epistemology or metaphysics. So I think, again, this is something that is complementary to, and in fact, sociologists of science like Feyerabend, generally speaking. I don't want to overgeneralize, but they are much more Feyerabend friendly than some philosophers I found, which I think is interesting.
And there is a good story for us to tell about why Feyerabend is unpopular amongst some philosophers, because the main reason for this is Feyerabend's relationship to various pseudoscientific practices. I mean, there are many reasons that philosophers of science at least used to dislike Feyerabend. He can be very provocative. He flirted with cultural relativism for a time. He could be very provocative and punchy and quite aggressive sometimes in his writings in ways that didn't always help him. He is not innocent when it comes to his bad reputation, but that's a long story. So let's just focus upon his relationship to the pseudosciences, because at least at the start of his career, Feyerabend was a very conventional philosopher of science. He starts working within a positivistic kind of philosophy of science. Then he starts to work with Popper. He does a lot of philosophy of physics and quantum mechanics, and he's very well trained in that. It starts off very conventional, and then all starts to go wrong. And part of that going wrong is, of course, his views on pseudoscience. So So why don't you start that story? What went wrong?
Well, what went wrong? What went wrong was that I think he was also, although his history is sometimes really infuriating, because you try to track Feyerabend sources and it becomes a really difficult task when you can pin down exactly what he was reading. But one of the things that I think happened was that he started looking into more like historical case studies, and from there I think he developed views that then gradually became or were misunderstood. So one example that I have is, so this is Feyerabend after he had published his the work that made him famous as a philosopher of science, Against Method. We are at Feyerabend sort of like commenting on something that had happened in 1975 in one of his most polemic and in principle relativistic works, in Science in a Free Society. Feyerabend is commenting on a statement produced in 1975 by 186 scientists and published in the magazine The Humanist. Right, the magazine actually is still going, right? And in The Humanist, the scientists felt the need to gather 186 signatures, of which some are Nobel Prizes, to express a concern about astrology. And the statement opens like this. It's titled Objections to Astrology, a statement by 186 leading scientists. And it starts with, scientists in a variety of fields have become concerned about the increased acceptance of astrology in many parts of the world. We, the undersigned astronomers, astrophysicists, and scientists in other fields, wish to caution the public against the unquestioning acceptance of the predictions and advice given privately and publicly by astrologers, right? And then the document continues for about a page, and then you get a long string of signatures. And it's really interesting to actually zoom in and go and look at who signed this statement, because the first line of signatures are all Nobel Prizes, right? So there is Hans Bethe signed this, Sir Francis Crick, Sir John Eccles, I'm going a little bit further down, Konrad Lorenz. So these are all names that are quite popular among Linus Pauling, right? Julian Schwinger, and so on. So physicists, biologists, Nobel Prizes, and then there are the signatures of the academics. And Feyerabend in Science in a Free Society has a really nice way of putting the problem with this. That I think really drives the point, Ian, that you were making before. He says, to drive the point home, I shall briefly discuss the statement of 186 leading scientists against astrology in the September-October issue 1975 of The Humanist. I'll skip a couple of lines. He says, now, what surprises the reader whose image of science has been formed by the customary eulogies which emphasize rationality, objectivity, impartiality, and so on, is the religious tone of the argument, of the document, the illiteracy of the arguments, and the authoritarian manner in which the arguments are being presented. The learned gentlemen have strong convictions. They use their authority to spread those convictions. Why 186 signatures when one has arguments? They know a few phrases which sound like arguments, but they certainly do not know what they are talking about. And then Feyerabend embarks on a critique. He starts, in fact, by bringing up a textbook on witchcraft from, I think, the 16th century, and showing how even the Catholic Church, which is the epitome of authoritarianism, had engaged with witchcraft in a way that was more open-minded than these 186 scientists arguing against astrology. So I think this is really a nice point to say, and this is Feyerabend at his most relativistic, most postmodern, if we want to follow his critics, at his most postmodern, if we want to follow his critics, but he still engages with the arguments, and he still tries not to say astrology is scientific, but he says, if we really want to engage with this, we need to do our work properly. It's about arguments. It's not about asserting from authority that there is a concern about astrology and the uneducated public should not pay attention to it from the authority of the scientists themselves.
Yes, if you read that statement, the statement itself, as Feyerabend points out, this is not a scientific document. It is a statement of authority.
Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, you don't establish claims in the sciences by gathering signatures. Science does not work on a petition basis. And then, as Feyerabend points out, in a way that's very savage and very funny, but also very critically effective, it's really poor. In fact, as Feyerabend takes glee in pointing out that when one of the signatories was later interviewed by the BBC and said, "Can you tell me more about why astrology is bunk?" the Nobel Prize winner said, "I can't. I don't know anything about astrology." And as Feyerabend says, these folks don't know the history of astrology, the methodology of astrology. Their arguments against it are very weak. In some cases, they make ridiculous claims. So the statement includes the claim, there is no effect of astronomical phenomena upon terrestrial life.
Yes.
Feyerabend says, sunshine, waves, gravitation, occasional meteoric and cometary impacts. He said it's such a lazy, sloppy document. They make appalling claims like this. And in a way, which I think for him is the more important problem, that's super authoritarian, because they're not signing it as, Mr. Konrad Lorenz, it's Professor Konrad Lorenz. They're making the statement by appealing to their scientific authority, and yet they display none of the virtues and none of the standards of scientific inquiry. Scientists should not rely upon assertions and appeals to authority. They should display knowledge, understanding, systematically go through, argument, evidence. They don't do any of that. It's such an obvious red rag to the Feyerabendian bull, and his takedown of it is just fantastic.
But this also makes it very clear why you, Ian, have moved in your academic trajectory from Feyerabend to epistemic virtues. I think that brings it to the fore very nicely.
Well, I think that this is because the astrology case does explain why Feyerabend acquired this negative reputation, because elsewhere in that book and in other work in the 1970s, he seems to defend astrology, witchcraft, parapsychology, alternative medicine, parapsychological phenomena. And I can well see why people thought that he just lost the plot. And Feyerabend later said that was the one book of mine I'd rather not have reprinted. But then again, if you do look at what he says about these phenomena, it seems to me very clear he's not making a general claim that these work. He's not saying anything goes. He displays enormous knowledge of them, but knowing a lot about the history of witchcraft doesn't mean that you endorse witchcraft. It just means you know a lot about it. And in most cases, Feyerabend doesn't actually indicate any commitment to them. His general strategy is people with epistemic authority have dismissed this. They're clearly ignorant of it. And I'm going to offer a principled defense, not because I think it should be defended, not because I think it's right, but because it's being unfairly attacked and it merits a defense. I think in the only case, to my knowledge, where he comes close to saying that this might work is in certain specific cases of certain kinds of alternative medicine, when Feyerabend, who had chronic pain due to war injuries, said, I tried this therapy and it did work. But that's hardly an endorsement of voodoo, parapsychology, and all the rest of it. In most cases, once you peel back some of his rhetoric, actually, he's making far more modest points.
Yeah.
I mean, my suspicion is that in the 1970s at conferences, in front of an audience full of people fueled up by adrenaline and with his dramatic temperament, I can imagine him saying, yeah, I believe in astrology. I'm being telepathic right now. But the written record is the best indication of his measured views. He just doesn't come out with the wild claims people think.
And his theater background might have helped him with maybe the kind of like the performance at conferences side. I mean, he was also like very much engaged. I mean, what I like about Feyerabend was that he did practice what he preached and he would engage in conversations, again, in an undogmatic way. And I think there was also, I don't know, what Feyerabend taught me, let's put it that way. What Feyerabend taught me is the ability to listen seriously, because there might be all kinds of reasons why people would espouse ideas that we wouldn't subscribe to.
Yes.
And I think this is a problem. This is one of the things that makes working on Feyerabend especially timely, because there is a lot of broadcasting these days, but there is very little listening and engaging in meaningful conversations. And I think one of the things that I've learned by engaging with Feyerabend, even being enraged by him, because sometimes he annoys me, is okay, so like if I follow the thread of the argument, first of all, is there an argument? But then is there something else in the context in which this particular type of argumentation has emerged, or this particular position, right? I've been thinking a lot about this, because in our current day and age, discussions can turn violent when they are very condensed, for example, on social media. I'm not very fond of social media myself, and I prefer to actually have conversations with people precisely for that reason, that then the argument is truncated and it escalates very quickly, or it gets very quickly polarized. And so it's about bringing it back, first of all, to the slow talking. And Feyerabend doesn't have this, but it's something that you can sort of extrapolate from some of his ideas if you want to sort of update Feyerabend to the 21st century.
And that is something that we also should do. I mean, for one thing, discussions about pseudosciences haven't gone away. But also, I think one nice thing about lots of Feyerabend's discussions is that there's a sort of double principle of humility at work. I mean, one is the point you made that, people might look back at, let's say, certain kinds of parapsychological research and say, what morons those Victorians were. How could you believe in this? Yeah. But there's a kind of arrogance there, the arrogance of thinking, well, if I'd have been there then, in that environment, in that context, with those influences, I would have been able to rise above it, and I wouldn't have been duped. But that's an immense arrogance, that, I wouldn't have been taken in, that I have some direct line to the truth. Whereas Feyerabend liked to do in some of his history of science lectures is, let's say the claim is Aristotle's geocentric cosmology. Students all scoff and laugh. How could such an intelligent person believe such nonsense? And then, we know from lecture accounts, Feyerabend would take them through Aristotle's account of the world, and then say to the students, right, so if you were in this context, what would you believe about the world? What would you believe? Yeah. And they would all say, well, I would think it was flat for all the reasons that you gave, and I would believe that the sun went around it for all the reasons. And that's not Feyerabend being naughty and endorsing geocentrism. It's, I think, trying to break a sort of arrogant conceit on the part of the students. Just because they're a long time ago doesn't mean they're stupid. And just because you're now doesn't mean that you would have been able to see the truth. Yeah. And a second kind of humility, I suppose, is recognizing that there are severe contingencies to what we count as the sciences. If history had gone a very different way, we could have ended up with very, very different sciences. And things that we now regard as ridiculous would have been taken as perfectly obvious, and vice versa. Yeah. And again, saying that history is very contingent doesn't just mean that you throw your hands up in the air and say it's all relativistic. Yeah. We can still work hard and engage all of our epistemic virtues to do good research, but we should do so with awareness of contingency. Maybe some things seem ridiculous to us, not because we have brilliant arguments against them and knockdown refutations, just because history took us in a direction where these things seem obvious to us. Yeah. But if it had gone another way, those same things would have seemed obviously wrong. Yeah. And I think the function of all of this humility is to drive kinds of critical inquiry where you bracket your assumptions and push forwards in ways that don't involve appeals to authority, dismissals about the ridiculousness of these phenomena, and certain kinds of insult. Put one point about pseudoscience is, whatever scientists and philosophers think about it, a lot of people are into it, and they're still into it. And that humanist declaration didn't say we should get the sociologists and the psychologists to try to work out, why do people keep going for this? Yes. Why go for this attitude of dismissal? These people are morons, and we're going to hold up a piece of paper that says scientists tell you to believe otherwise. That is a terrible way to engage with the public. And as
Yeah.
Feyerabend says, there are better ways to do it.
Yeah. And also, I think alongside and with this, I think we might need to wrap up because we're running towards a question time. But I also think that argument about contingency and history and contingency not being everything up for grabs really points again back to the values that we embrace and decide to embrace in our societies, right? And it's about celebrating on one hand the diversity that characterizes perspectives, different kinds of perspectives, but also at the same time to be able to sort of share and negotiate those values, because that's the way in which we then decide what kind of values we want to embrace. Like, we have agency in deciding what kind of world we want to have, and I think science is a really big part of that kind of conversation, and there isn't enough of that. And I think with Feyerabend there was a beginning of that. Thomas Kuhn also talked about values more from a kind of epistemological perspective. Philosophers of science now have much more fully fledged accounts of the kind of impossibility of removing values from science. And so how do we work with those values in making those choices that then take us in one direction rather than another? And taking responsibility for those values is a really important part of that conversation. Exactly. But I think we should open things up maybe for questions.
Hi. Yes, I was just going to say, speaking of engaging with the public, we can engage with the Q&A, and we've got some great questions that have come in. I guess on the note that we were just talking about, Josh's question kind of ties into it. So he asks, from the vantage point of an approach to science, which is kind of a social construction, which can't really be separated from other modes of culture, doesn't the value label of pseudo presuppose a metaphysical notion of science as a privileged method of access to truth relative to other cultural discourses?
Yeah, I don't like using the word pseudoscience very much. Precisely because of that. I'd rather go like zoom in on a particular, I would talk about astrology, I would talk about telepathy, I would talk about ufology, but creating this big pseudoscience container, I think, is problematic, precisely because it puts me in the authority position of deciding where I draw the boundary. And I think, it's an argument from authority there that I am making. Having said that, I mean, it's not that I would say when COVID happened, I ran for my vaccine. I literally ran for my vaccine, right? But again, it's about, the question that I asked myself at that point, and I did have conversations actually with people that refused on different kinds of grounds, and I realized how complicated and tangled the arguments are on the other side. For me, it was straightforward to go and get my COVID vaccine, but I had long conversations with people who had different kinds of arguments, and it was interesting actually to see that a lot of that was less about science and more about the political role that they attributed certain scientific practices to have with respect to their own position in society, or with respect to their own political visions. And that was a very interesting, eye-opening conversation, frustrating, but eye-opening. Sorry, have I bypassed the question? Ian, bring me back on track.
But just one point it's worth making is that, one of Feyerabend's signature claims is that there's no one thing called the scientific method. I mean, for a long time, one of the ideas is, well, all the different things that we call science are sciences because they're unified by this amazing thing called the scientific method, which guarantees that science has a special epistemic status. And Feyerabend pointed out, anyone who's done any science or knows history of science knows there isn't a scientific method. There's a whole plurality of scientific methods, formal and informal. There are experimental fudges, ad hoc adjustments. The methods vary enormously. Some allegedly scientific methods also have a role in alleged non-sciences. So he says science is extremely pluralistic. In fact, arguably there's no single thing called the sciences. But then again, that also means that there can't be any single demarcation criteria. There's no one thing that makes science, so there can't be one demarcation criteria. So for Popper, falsifiability is the mark of science with a capital S, but there's no thing called science with a capital S, and so the falsifiability criteria won't work there. So maybe what you would get then is a whole plurality of different criteria and different standards, some of which might rule certain pseudosciences in, but it might rule others out. One interesting example, at least in the late 90s, was string theory. Now, string theory was criticized as pseudoscientific for a variety of reasons. For instance, it's hyper-mathematical and has very little empirical confirmation. If you think empirical confirmation is the mark of a science, it's going to be a no for string theory. If you think that mathematical sophistication is a criteria, then it's ruled in. And the problem here is that you get pluralism within science and you get pluralism outside of the sciences. And although pluralism is very often wise, it almost always makes things much more complicated. But then Feyerabend will say, yeah, it's science. It's human inquiry into reality. Humans are complex. Reality is very complex, this just in. And therefore, it's just going to be much messier and more complicated and more work than, for example, the signatories to the Humanist Declaration is. They're after an easy kill for what is, in fact, an extremely complex, diverse range of targets. It's just lazy.
I suppose related to that, we have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks how the various versions of the demarcation problem are reflective of the political context. So perhaps some concrete examples of how it's related to the politics of the time.
I suppose one easy example is the idea that dialectical materialism is a pseudoscience. That was a popular example. But crucially, it was a popular example whilst the Soviet Union and whilst Marxism were considered dominant and threatening cultural and ideological forces. It was very important for enemies of communism/socialism to show that dialectical materialism is bogus, because that was the alleged science at the heart of a certain political vision of the world. So that would be the classic example of a politicized pseudoscience.
I mean, there are kind of authors working at the kind of boundary between history and epistemology and histories of epistemology. There is a very good book by Lorraine Duston called How Reason Almost Lost Its Mind. And it is a collection of essays. And one of the things that sort of like emerges is how much the field of philosophy of science as such and the ways in which some of these debates were framed was itself an outcome, if you like, of Cold War politics, right? And then you start, like, when you kind of start realizing some of these, like you start from the details and then you go and read the authors and you go like, oh yeah, like that's why Marxism is such a big deal at this point, you can do the same with psychoanalysis in Popper's critique of psychoanalysis. There are all kinds of reasons why Popper just didn't like that. Of course, Popper himself, with his own trajectory of having to flee Europe during World War II, is very adamant about the kind of like maintaining science as a free enterprise. That is itself, I think, a political position alongside the epistemological arguments that he builds around them. He wanted to make damn sure that science would be free from ideology. You can say something similar for a lot of the Vienna Circle philosophers as well, in the previous kind of logical empiricism and logical positivism. So there are lots of examples.
Yeah, those are great. And that's a good book recommendation that people can look at. We have a question from Alice Tamimi. who asks that in addition to pseudoscience, deviations from the scientific ideal that come to mind are anti-science or bad science. Example, Ben Goldacre.
Yeah.
Alice has two questions. Do you think there are any interesting crossovers between pseudoscience, anti-science, and bad science? And do you think there are other interesting categories for deviations that you can think of in addition to these three?
The way I would look at these is, again, like, the way I would look at these is, again, in terms of what's at stake in creating these labels to start with, right? So, and again, when we are thinking, okay, this is an anti-science type of argument, I mean, Feyerabend himself was defined as the worst enemy of science and as being anti-science, right? Or producing anti-scientific content. And again, I think it's only by engaging with the specificity of the arguments that you can say this is just being anti-science with the same position of authority as the scientists of the statement against astrology, or this is a critique of science. So I work in a department of science studies and science and technology studies, and because of the debates of the 1980s and the 90s, we've been defined, and occasionally there is still somebody who says, oh, you're anti-science because you do history, philosophy, sociology of science, right? So you're critical of science. But being critical of science means you care about science, right? It means you want it to be the best science we can have as a human enterprise and as a human endeavor, right? You can't do that without being critical, right? Sorry, I've gone on. Ian.
I think Alice asks very good questions. I mean, I suppose one term that's often used in these debates is scientism.
Yeah.
Now, scientism is a very difficult term to get a grip on, and I think we do better to think about scientism in relation to specific topics. So the very bland definition is scientism involves exaggerated accounts of the nature, the scope, the power of science. But scientism is often invoked in these kinds of debates. So if you defend pseudoscience, you're sometimes accused of being anti-science. But then again, people also get accused of being too into science. They are scientistic. They have absurdly inflated ideas about the sciences. And I think some people who champion scientism do so because they genuinely think it's the best way to defend the sciences. They see pseudoscience and anti-science as excesses in the negative direction, so they go for the excesses in the positive direction in the hope that you'll end up with a sort of equilibrium in the middle. But then again, as was pointed out by Feyerabend, by Mary Midgley and many others, if you try to proceed in a debate by pushing things to the extremes, you're just going to end up with polarization and smashing from one extreme position to another. What you really want is a much more sensible middle course, which will lack all the drama and the excitement of exaggerated scientific claims or polemical pseudoscientific claims. But then again, that is just a feature of debate. And Feyerabend himself, of course, got this wrong. You know, he did lapse into excessive provocation, partly temperamental, partly because of wider events in his personal life. There are lots of reasons that human beings tend towards these kind of intellectual extremes, but that's why philosophers will emphasize things like epistemic virtues, including the really boring virtues of the mind, like carefulness, thoroughness, conscientiousness, knowing your history. Because one thing that really does make people more vulnerable to pseudoscience is general ignorance about science, just not knowing much about science. And that's partly going to be a problem of science education. I mean, it's not the case that if you know a lot about science, you won't fall for pseudoscience. There are lots of people who are very well educated about the sciences who fall for pseudoscience. Lots of conspiracy theorists are extremely well informed. They're not stupid people. The problem is then that you'd have to find ways of educating people about science that includes a bit of history of science, a bit of philosophy of science. That will help to insulate people against all of these different excesses. So maybe something like scientism belongs in those debates, but also trying to encourage a much more moderate, sensible attitudes towards the sciences. You don't have to go extreme. You can walk a middle path, and science is very interesting without all these needless, distracting dramas.
while we're on the topic of epistemic virtues and vices, Francis asks, since Feyerabend challenged epistemic authority of science, do you think he's a deflationist with respect to epistemic virtues?
I'd need to know a little bit more about what deflationism about epistemic virtues are, but I suppose if one thought that Francis might have is this: if you challenge the epistemic authority of science, you're somehow weakening the sciences. So if science isn't this fantastical bit of epistemic machinery, it's something much more modest and limited in scope, that's also going to shrink the scope for the virtues. I don't think so. I think whatever your conception of science is, whether you think it's genuinely describing reality as it is in itself, or whether you think it's just a useful set of descriptions of the world that helps us to develop technologies that make every day a bit easier, either way, you have a very rich conception of science that would include different kinds of virtues. You know, you can be creative, curious, and epistemically expansive, no matter what your conception of science is. So you get different flavors of epistemic virtues, but I wouldn't think that Feyerabend would see that as a problem.
Yeah. I mean, the other very straightforward way is if you are a pluralist in a Feyerabendian sense, you won't be deflationist about virtues. You will want them to proliferate and, you know, and be in some sort of like relationship or engagement with each other.
So I had a question kind of related to that. And I know, Chiara, you work in the relation between science and art. And since you were just talking about innovation and creative thinking, I was wondering if you guys could say more about that relationship.
Oh, that's a really good one. Do we have another hour? We've got 3 minutes. So one of the things that I found really fun to do is to actually go and look at Feyerabend. So the one thing that I've written about Feyerabend is a chapter where I go and look at the sources that Feyerabend uses from the history of art to talk about science. And he was reading very widely about the history of art. In fact, I've only scratched the surface. There is a lot more work on what Feyerabend might say on science and art, but he uses art a lot as a metaphor to talk about science, right? And he also uses art, the visual arts a lot, but also theater. I haven't gone very much into what he has to say about theater. I've stuck a little bit more with the visual. But one of the things that probably attracted me to Feyerabend is that, you know, I was coming from this, when I was early in my career, from this idea that if you were good at the humanities, you couldn't be good at science. And if you were good at science, you couldn't be good at the humanities, and that they had to be completely separate. And one of the things that I worked out when I was doing my PhD was that actually I was interested in both, right? Not in terms of being a practicing scientist, but I was interested in like the place that science has in our society. But also I realized that a lot of artists were looking at science and they were appropriating scientific ideas. And in appropriating those scientific ideas, new beautiful artistic things would happen, right? And these beautiful artistic things are not just beautiful, but they ask questions that they are complementary to the questions that the sciences ask, right? They're questions about our place in the world. They're questions about what this universe is made of. What's the nature of space? I've done a lot of work on cubism, and a lot of the cubists were massively into their maths and their non-Euclidean geometries because they were asking the question through painting about what's the nature of space. And that question to me is a very philosophical question, it can be complementary to the questions that science asks. Artists just pursue it through aesthetic means. And scientists also use aesthetic means in their own research. So when they use a picture, they make decisions about that picture or that model on the basis of aesthetic values, as well as the epistemic, and the aesthetic and the epistemic is never separated. And Feyerabend, I think, picked up quite a bit of that. He kind of like threw it out there in various bits of his papers, and I've tried to sort of start reconstructing what he had to say about it. And I've made some interesting discoveries about the sources and how widely read he was and what kind of art he liked, but also what he had to say about the role of representation in science by analogy with representation in art. And I'm really sorry I've gone on this. I would have so much more to say, but I know we are out of time. Any
closing comments from you, Ian?
Just one thought on the interesting question about creativity and innovation. I mean, one of the things that Feyerabend would always emphasize is the constant danger in human life of one-sided thinking. It's very difficult to keep our minds moving between a variety of perspectives. And that will be true as well of thinking about something like creativity and innovation. You know, Feyerabend himself will emphasize creativity, innovation, boldness, imaginativeness, new connections, the unexpected. That makes sense temperamentally, and that's a genuine set of epistemic virtues. But there's also a wider range of virtues that don't get as much airplay that are also very important to sciences, like diligence, thoroughness, not creating new things, but preserving old things. There are virtues of double checking and going over things again, as well as creating new kinds of knowledge. And, you know, one of the ways to think about Feyerabend's philosophy is exploring the kind of the energetic aspects of science that achieve popular attention, but also behind those, there's the duller set of scientific virtues as well, because a lot of scientific work, if you've ever done it, is very boring. And one of the problems with a lot of pseudoscience is it appeals to those energetic fizzy virtues like boldness and creativity, but it doesn't often acknowledge enough about those boring, plodding virtues that I think is really the core of responsible intellectual life. I mean, it's very important to be innovative and creative and to push boundaries and horizons, but it's also important to be conscientious, thorough, have a respect for tradition and for what's already been learned. That's the counter set of virtues that you need just as much as the virtues that pull you forward. Because as the pseudoscience debate shows, if you're overloaded in favor of these fizzy, expansive virtues, you can end up in dodgy pseudoscientific territory. In the best case scenario, you end up with some false beliefs. In the worst case scenarios, you end up indulging theories that are politically noxious, publicly dangerous, and destructive of public trust in science.